We don't want this to... Go.
Ready? All right, well, terrific. The concluding event, money on the left. I'd like to just start by saying that this has been tremendous. I don't know that I've ever enjoyed a conference quite as much as I've enjoyed this one. My mind is just swimming with so many ideas and new things to have learned, and so I'd like to begin by raising a glass to everybody here, especially our organizers, Scott, Billy, and Max, for all the hard work that they've done to really make a tremendous event, and to their students and everybody just for making it for welcoming and amazing environment for discussion and knowledge, etc. So
maybe pick up the mic so we can get a little more.
Get us in there.
Yeah, get up in there.
It's one that actually
All
amplifies.
right.
Yeah, right.
This is the end now. It's like a wedding toast, I guess. It's really dangerous. To the bride and groom. So this is really exciting to be here and to talk about this project. We've been working on it really since the fall. This bigger idea, for me, the inspiration for this comes from kind of this broader discussion about money that's been taking place in the media, and this observation that money really is just one big experiment without really acknowledging that it's an experiment. So, beginning in the 1980s, the monetarist experiment explicitly described as such, followed by Taylor rules, and then the new monetary consensus, and most recently with the crisis, thinking about quantitative easing and non-traditional monetary policy activities. And to me, experimenting with money at such a macro level seems a little bit irresponsible and kind of dangerous. Monetary experiments have an impact on everybody's lives, and some of these lives are impacted disproportionately to others. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is how would we do monetary experiments at a micro level that might be scaled up to a macro sort of project influenced by modern money and jobs guarantees and these sorts of ideas, sort of a way of planting the seed in communities about what this might look like. So giving the opportunity for some learning by doing, not only for our students, but for the general community out there. And so the micro experiment for me is really influenced by a couple of different areas: the complementary and community currency space, how those currencies have activated inactive value when communities don't have access to the central currency system, allowing single mothers to find meaningful and useful work outside of the household to help pay bills and provide extra stability, reducing waste, all these sorts of things. And then on a practical scale, the way that we teach monetary systems in my classes and from my training at UMKC is to implement my own currency system and have students do service learning activities in exchange for my currency. And then I announced that at the end of the class they have to pay me a tax in my currency, and I won't accept any other currency that I call the Benjamin. Or they don't get the credit toward their score. So it's voluntary. I mean, if they don't want to get the 10% or whatever it is for their grade, they can choose not to do it. But anybody willing and able to do it can work and go out into this service learning sector and achieve these sorts of things. And really the limitation of this learning process is that it ends at the semester. So the students really only do as much work as it takes to satisfy the assignment. And I've wanted to expand it on a broader scale to see what happens when we have overlapping generations and more time, and students might be able to accumulate one semester where they find a volunteer opportunity that they really like, and then make time in the future where they want to pursue a different endeavor, those sorts of ideas. And so what we've proposed is a digital currency system that would be issued out of our Institute for Civic Engagement. So kind of a an institutional structure for helping students find long-term placements and these sorts of things. And we've thought about it in a way to really direct the currency system toward a particular value. The interest rate gets dropped by the Federal Reserve, and there's really no discussion about what sorts of activities that sort of monetary experiment is encouraging other than for-profit behaviors. So one of the themes I think that we've seen in this conference is that, Oscar Wilde used to say, we know the price of everything but the value of nothing. So how do we begin to imagine the valuing of different things? And so the framework for this is the Cortland County food system. So Cortland County is in the center of the state of New York. It's usually one of the 5 or 10 poorest counties in the state of New York. Traditional urban or rural Rust Belt sort of space. And working with community leaders, I've become part of a Cortland Food Project Steering Committee that was awarded a USDA grant to think about how they would want to change their food system. And so they issued a survey to both consumers and producers to say what are the boundaries to producing more local foods for local consumption, and from the consumer side, what are the barriers or problems or even the desire to purchase local foods. And that data was strongly supported that both producers and consumers want to do more of this, but there's distributive problems, and it's an investment for a farm to change the way that they're doing things to achieve those sorts of goals, and there's risk involved. And so if we could figure out a way to provide some labor and some investments and to allow those sorts of changes, that's really one of the goals that we have here. So the first component of the project is this monetary experiment. The second component is linking the monetary experiment to a particular value stream designated by the community that we found in food, and then targeting the food system from an economic perspective at consumption, production, and distribution. So consumption, focus on the dietary difference of eating a lot of local and healthy foods. There's obesity, diabetes, these sorts of issues in Cortland County that are fairly prevalent. So this could give us some method, especially over 5 years, to see if we're making an impact there. In the production space, and this is where more of the environmental stuff occurs, we've proposed a number of micro projects that, too, like the money system, could be scaled up. Riparian buffer zone placements of ecological growth along streams to absorb fertilizers and runoff and these sorts of things, and retain it on the property for the farmer, which has its own benefits. And then in-stream ecological interventions to increase both plant, insect, and animal life to potentially even be great enough to have more fisheries. There's quite a few trout streams, and fly fishing is part of New York's sporting history, but a lot of that's been dried up in particularly the Finger Lakes region because of agricultural runoff, etc. So it would be kind of another place for job creation and guiding, and maybe even revenues for farmers to allow licensees for people to fish private waters and things like this. And then in distribution, the real issue is food access and food insecurity. Portland, being a poor community, has a number of people that are taking on SNAP and WIC and other benefits to try to feed themselves and their families. And even on campus, a recent survey found that almost 30% of our students experience food insecurity on a basis each semester, at least once. So these are all things that we think that we can begin to make a dent in, and that we can quantify over the course of the grant. And one of the tools that we want to use in order to do that is by issuing it as a digital currency. It'll be much easier to track. The way that I do it now is I issue Benjamins that are on an old business card, and there's some cost to that for me, and then I collect back pieces of paper that identify that they've done this work with the community service, and so there's lots of logistics, and that's kind of an uphill climb to get other faculty on board, right? There's a setup cost to doing this sort of thing, but by developing this software and an app that would be on the telephone for our students, and then a centralized database collection, then the other faculty would just be saying that they're part of this program, sign up, have their own login, and they would just be able to, download the data and make sure that their students are doing the service learning that they want. And theoretically, they could not even really mention, the project if they didn't feel comfortable talking about it. I could be a guest speaker, any of those sorts of things. So it gives a lot more flexibility to it to expand it very rapidly to a number of classes and disciplines, and it expands the space for the service learning too, eventually, where we'll open it up and allow people to volunteer in any space, whether it's the food system or sitting with the elderly in assisted care, or reading to young children, or anything that students really feel passionate or want to go do. And so that data collection will both be collected through transactions, so who and where they're volunteering with, and the where will be tracked using geographic information systems. So we'll have kind of a spatial understanding of where the money is going, so that we can, as the data is collected, we can overlay that with the geography of the town and the county to see if there are places where, we need more riparian zones here. The Community Science Lab, CSI, is one of our partners, and they're in Ithaca, and they've got something like 575 water collection testing sites. So they've opened up that data to us. Students can help collect that in a more frequent way. The other big partner is Seven Valleys Health Coalition, who's sponsoring the Portland Food Project. And they've got, their partnerships are at the national, state, and local level. All the food pantries within the Portland County and Tompkins County, the neighboring county to our south. Tompkins Portland Community College is involved in their sustainable farming program, is a big support, and some of the production things that we're going to do experimentally on their property is the dehydration and flash freezing of produce in order to save and prevent it from going into waste. They've got some experimental compost programs. And then the layer that we'd like to add to the currency systems data component eventually is this alert system for CSA, community supported agriculture, restaurants, that say we have X amount of tomatoes here that we haven't been able to distribute. Does anybody have a usage for it, so that we can transfer that food and prevent it from going into a waste? Even if it's being composted, it could be somebody's dinner, which I think is a more useful use of tomatoes. So there's a lot of things going on here, and it's a very exciting project, mostly because there's so many people that are really excited about it. All the partners, the faculty that I've talked to on campus, the Institute for Civic Engagement, even the administration of the college, because service learning and applied learning are becoming such a large new part of pedagogy, and they really don't have a meaningful way of keeping track of this or quantifying or sharing with others just how much of this we're doing. And so we'll really be providing a meaningful and verifiable data source for this sort of activity that should open the door for new grants, more research, all sorts of other activities that I think are a really exciting opportunity. So at this point, I think I'll turn it over to Rohan to talk a little bit more about how we're harnessing this technology and how this technology differs from what we're hearing about in the news and where we're going from there.
I'll start by just again thanking Ben, because this was Ben's brainchild and vision, and he really brought everybody together in an amazing way to sit down with 6 or 7 large food production science institutions in the area, multiple universities. We have a technologist who is currently the head of Ithacash, which is the local Ithaca Hours sort of successor, one of the most famous complementary currencies in the US, who is our sort of local technologist. We have my advisor Robert Hockett, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, who is sort of connecting this up on the legal regulatory side, and sort of Ben's bringing the economic cavalry. So it's been a pleasure to be part of this and to see an example of the kind of thing that I've been talking about the last couple of days at this conference, of finding ways to show that what we're proposing is concrete, non-utopian, builds on existing infrastructure, existing projects. It reimagines and pulls things together in new ways, but we're not requiring a completely new toolkit. We can find and repurpose existing money, existing systems, existing capacities and interests, and show them how this technology or this framework can open up new ways of achieving that. So I'll talk about 4 different aspects of the technology and how it fits to the broader MMT conversation that we've been having this weekend. The first is the sort of core MMT principle, as Minsky once described, that taxes drive money, as a crude shorthand for the sort of more nuanced idea that any non-reciprocal obligation that can be imposed on somebody can drive a demand for whatever you need to then earn to satisfy that imposition. It's a pretty simple concept. If someone puts a gun to your head and tells you to dance or they're going to shoot you, suddenly you have a need to know how to dance that you didn't need before. So in this context, building on what Matt mentioned, I think it was yesterday, there are ways to think about taxation, or the idea of a sort of one-way imposition of a requirement that isn't simply the same as jail or prison, or some idea where you're born in chains and going to be in chains the rest of your life. Intentional communities still have rules and responsibilities, and it's possible to imagine through intentional communities a way in which we can have a more egalitarian and acceptable relationship to the sort of economic powers that are wielded by the government and entities on its behalf, and that claim to always be acting benevolently, but as we know, is not always the case. So in this context, people want to go to school. People already accept the idea that teachers have a right to tell you how you should be learning in their classroom and to impose work requirements on you that you have to do. You'll never find employers as demanding on your body and soul as you will with your teachers, for good reason, but maybe you will get out of that job. But they have a relationship that is asymmetrical by definition. And so starting from that point of view is not the same as saying, hey, I thought I was walking into an egalitarian horizontal space and suddenly someone's put a gun to my head. It's not the same logic, it's not the same feeling of unfreedom or of a loss of sovereignty or autonomy. And so that's why we're starting there as a way to reimagine how currency can be related to by people. So the idea of taxes driving money here, Ben talked about the idea of course credit, which is an obvious one. It's literally the most captive audience you have, unless people fly to Florida for a conference. And then you can go beyond that to things like paying student contributions to the university, the kind of things that go into setting up student unionism and the requirements for that. I went to law school. We have 50 hours of pro bono requirements before you can apply to sit the bar exam or get your degree, depending on what university you go to. So there are a whole range of ways in which universities impose requirements that could be brought under the umbrella here beyond an individual class. That's the start of the idea, but not the end. And on that idea, one of the things that we have talked about at the Modern Money Network is taking that idea of taxes, which is usually very direct, very reliable and happening every single year, death and taxes, nothing is stable except death and taxes, and replacing it with an idea of risk. Because when you're a lawyer, you walk down the street, whether you're driving a car or next to a car that's about to hit you, you're assuming certain kinds of risk and you are incurring certain kinds of risk. And whether or not you have to pay your taxes, whether or not you earn enough income to have an income tax, you are always subject to some kind of legal liability risk. And that in and of itself can be enough to drive a demand for currency depending on who you are and how severe that risk is. So in the university context, we don't need even a guaranteed demand of every person in a community for a currency. We just need the idea that at some point in the future they might want to have some relationship with that space. So we could imagine things like lifelong learning as a way to increase the quote-unquote taxable power of a university, because people might want to earn that currency at some point in some quiet, slow way, if they knew at some point in the future that would be usable to gain the kind of lifelong learning that they may be interested in. The second idea is the idea of the finance franchise, which is a concept that my advisor, Bob Hockett, came up with, which is really sort of just a legal formalization or clarification of the idea of the hierarchy of money, again going back to post-Keynesian heterodox economists, the endogenous money, the credit comes out of relationships between people and as a result of existing power relationships and institutional structures. Different people's debts have different degrees of quote-unquote moneyness. And part of that process is the degree to which the government or the final sovereign in that jurisdiction chooses to recognize those different liabilities. So the crude or the most obvious example right now is we have a system of commercial banks, which most of us put most of our wealth or financial savings into. And those banks issue their own liabilities, which we usually store in the form of demand deposits, but they are a contractual obligation of a general debt against the bank. You put your money in the bank, you do not own that money anymore. You have an IOU from the bank, which a lawyer from the Fed once joked, if you go to court and you get a judgment, that judgment is another liability against the bank. So if you have a deposit and you try to sue for collection, what you get is a deposit at the end of that process. So the idea of the finance franchise is looking at the actors that the government, through whatever range of legal and institutional arrangements, chooses to give higher degrees of moneyness to their liabilities than other actors. So we can see that most clearly with the commercial banking layer, which runs the retail deposit system, but we can also see that with other forms of financial institutions, corporations, things like that. The fact that the ECB or the Fed in QE1 purchased a number of quote-unquote blue chip corporate stocks. Now, they might have been seen to be low risk, but they weren't zero risk. The government was picking quote-unquote winners and losers in the choice to provide liquidity to those assets beyond what the market was willing to provide. That was a form of subsidization of a class of companies. If I was the one company on the other side of the cutoff of what counts as blue chip stocks, I might be pretty pissed about the cronyism implicit in that list. I'm not, so I don't care, but the point is that these hierarchies are created and recreated on an ongoing basis by a whole range of legal and regulatory decisions. When it comes to the Federal Reserve, when it was founded, as Bob likes to talk about, it explicitly states that one of the goals was not simply providing liquidity to the financial system, but providing liquidity directly to agricultural and other industries of the country. So it could be possible to imagine a quote-unquote franchise, as we talked about with complementary currencies at lunch the other day with Joe, that the Federal Reserve explicitly backstops local and complementary currencies in the way that it provides unsecured credit lines to the ECB or the Bank of England today. You could imagine that as an alternative way of bailing out the financial system the next time there's a crisis. Let the large banks go under, but help the homeowners, help the local cities, help the local states, whatever it is. And one of the great travesties, in my opinion, of the global financial crisis was that we didn't provide direct liquidity to states and municipalities. So while these financial institutions are getting literally free money, state and local entities are still having to borrow at significant rates of interest from the markets who get their liquidity from the Fed anyway. So when we think about the franchise here, what we're thinking about is new ways to federalize liquidity and credit and the sovereign money power, which is always and everywhere federalized. This isn't a matter of privatizing the money supply. This isn't a matter of taking away a power of the central government. This is a matter of looking at who our deputies are, whether they're operating in our interest, and whether we could maybe appoint some new deputies to go out there and be fiscal stewards and fiscal agents. So the third concept, which was one that our technologist Scott blanking, it's been a long weekend. Scott Morris provided is a concept of locally generated and sort of arbitrage value, so that we can have a currency where prices do something meaningful, both in terms of purchasing and in terms of production and earning power, but that aren't based on purely market logic. So a way of recognizing differences in value between workers, between the work, between projects, and allowing people to build a profile and build an economic sort of capacity beyond simply the most basic unskilled worker in the program. So this is looking at things like What happens when you gain experience? If this is your 4th semester at the same institution, should you be still considered the same as the person who came in the day before? Is there a way to bake into this process recognition of skills and capacities, whether those capacities are recognized through formal education or not? And I have been talking with people like Stephanie and Matt and Pavlina and others for a while about how we can take the idea of the universal job guarantee and connect it to education experience as a way of acknowledging the difference between work without undermining that universalist commitment to the lowest common denominator, which is the sort of emphasis of the job guarantee's minimum wage. So without wanting to do what some other job guarantee advocates do, which is just set wages at a prevailing wage rate in whatever market it is, so that if you happen to be lucky to be in an industry right now where you're getting $200,000 a year, that'll be preserved. If you aren't, you're screwed. Rather than that, saying that we can have a national, public, or community conversation about whether we value a nurse 3 times as much as the sort of nth banker who wants to graduate from one of these Ivy Leagues where 50% of them go into consulting or finance or something. We can have that conversation without undermining the universality of the process, because we are connecting it to other forms of publicly accountable formal systems, whether it's formal recognition of experience in the way that we do with internships, or whether it's formal recognition of education, the way that we do with courses and grades and degrees. God forbid a bunch of academics would say that there's no difference between an undergraduate and a professor, so I don't think that should be too hard to sell at this room. But the idea here is to think about the currency as the technology of value determination in this space. And the last point is the idea of distributed ledger technology, or the sort of payments technology itself. And so in this context, Ben was talking about a centralized database, but one aspect, and again, partially this is just buzzword crap to help with, grant applications and things like that, because, tech is so hot right now, but the idea is that certain entities in this ecosystem might be willing to contribute and participate, but might not want all of their data either pooled or shared with others. If you're a farmer in a region, it might be valuable to you to know what the overall soil acidity is in your region, but you also might not want to tell your competitor or something. So what this allows, at a very crude level, and not to say that this couldn't be done with other forms of digital database technology, but the idea of distributed ledgers is a way to say, the currency system can see everything while preserving the siloed nature of your data from everybody else's, so you aren't going to find that Cambridge Analytica is analyzing your soil without your permission or something like that. I want, just on that point though, part of this process is also, as Ben said, about thinking about models for scaling up. And it is important to note that the idea of currency coming down the pipes of this payments technology and data coming up the pipes of this payments technology is not too far from the model of Facebook and Twitter. Hopefully we're doing it for slightly more benevolent reasons. It's also not too dissimilar from the CIA and the NSA, who are hopefully we're also doing it for slightly more benevolent reasons, although that's what every state who tells themselves before they become the NSA or the CIA. So I think one critical question here is to think about, as we're building this space, as we're building these data commons and collection devices, how we can keep in view and in focus questions of autonomy, anonymity, privacy. One example of how our colleague Scott has done it with Ithacash is that and partially this is so we can avoid tax issues, good on him, but the way that happens is the online accounts are visible, but there is a cash token or a cash instrument that also circulates. And so you aren't necessarily supposed to be able to exchange these units for a fixed amount of money, because that would render it part of the regular monetary economy and therefore taxable. But once you earn these dollars and then you cash them out in cash, we're not going to look too closely at what you choose to do with your friend and whose pocket they end up in. And so it's not necessarily a design feature of the project that we're working on to bake into it sort of economic anonymity and transactional privacy, in part because the primary tax circuit is still our major focus. We're still trying to get labor, and at this point at least, the secondary economy of the private circulation of these IOUs is less of importance, whereas at the public level, obviously government spending and public spending is critically important, but also as important as the fact that we all then have money in our pockets and can communicate with each other. It's a very different world where you have a tax to participate in classes to earn your degree, but then you can't trade your degree for a beer at the end. It's not the same as when you earn money. So the ability to market or negotiate or sever your monetary assets from your person is a critical aspect of what distinguishes money from other forms of tax-driven value circuits. And in this case, even though we are allowing for that private circulation, our focus on the design level is still primarily on that public tax circuit. I think at the point at which you start thinking about transactional privacy, or alternatively, protection from the federal government, the one with the big army and things, that's when you really need to start thinking about these issues. So while I'm very excited and optimistic about this project and the way that it can illuminate and set a model for the federal level, I think it's also worth being very careful about when microcosmic examples don't scale or when there are problems that only emerge at scale. So I'll end it.
Yeah, just on a couple of things there. I mean, clearly Rohan is an incredible member of this team, and Bob and Scott. I mean, this has just been an amazing learning experience to try to put this project together, and all the issues that arise and the questions that we get from our community partners have all been so insightful and careful. One of the things to think about in scaling and experimenting is kind of the physician's idea of do no harm. I mean, we really have been thoughtful about, where are we going to be sending these service learning activities, for whom to benefit. If we're sending all of our students into the food system, are we going to be taking students away that were previously volunteering at the hospital? These sorts of issues. And so, and all the ways that we've strategized and tried to put this together, it's to maximize benefit for the community, the learning opportunities for our students, and to learn and share with the community both the value of eating local, producing local, environmental protections, and get some hands-on experience of what this looks like when we release money from these traditional constraints that we think about. I mean, I'm never going to run out of Benjamins, and we're never going to run out of these merits. I mean, the more students want to volunteer, it also, we're hoping that
local nonprofits are never going to run out of work to be done.
Yeah, well, unless we solve all the world's problems, which is not likely to happen in 5 years, but certainly we're looking to put a serious dent in food insecurity and hunger and the pollution that's in the water and the air, and so on and so forth. So we're very hopeful. Positive feedback to this point on the project. I recently had a conversation with the EPA, who heard about it and wanted to learn more. One of the things about anchor institutions that the university and its connection to the community, that really provides us with an advantage here of, two spaces that really want to have a positive relationship. The EPA as an institution would have that much greater reach if they wanted to issue their own currency to fund grant fundings that aren't being funded already. And I can hear their heads exploding over the telephone. So, people are starting to think about it. People really want to know what money is. I think, the way that it's being covered in the media with Bitcoin, I mean, certainly my students want to talk about money all the time now. And so I think hopefully we're hitting a moment in time where this sort of experiment will become scalable and will become repeatable, and we'll be able to solve problems beyond just food insecurity, reservation issues. We heard earlier this week, every community's got its problems and issues, and there's, most of that could be solved with labor and effort and care. Thank you.
Does anyone would like to ask questions? I don't know if we're going to hand around a mic. Is that the idea? I can repeat it back for the video if that's easiest. I don't know. Yeah, Scott, are we going to? I don't know what you.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, there's one behind you.
Oh, there's another one.
No, it's question.
This isn't going to amplify it, just for our video.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just hold it.
Is it serious? Or?
It's serious, yeah.
I can work with that.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I didn't realize this is, I'm sorry I missed the earlier part of this conference. You know, I only caught it now. But, so if I'm touching on a subject